Like the other speakers, I'd like to say how honored I am, how pleased I am to be here. We're talking to you today. And I first arrived here on the 75th anniversary of the NBZ when I was just beginning graduate school here at Whitaker. And of course now we're at the Centennial anniversary, so I'm delighted to be here. The timing of my talk I feel is a little bit rough. We're sort of getting to the end of the afternoon, people are getting a little worn down. I also have to say I'm slightly annoyed with some of the preceding speakers for sort of systematically stealing every one of my jokes that I've had lined up here to tell you. I did want to sort of mention, though, that it's interesting coming to a place like UC Berkeley, and some of the folks have sort of alluded to this, but you were welcomed in, and of course, it's a wonderful institution. It's congratulations, you've been accepted at this world-class university, and it's very famous place for invertebrate zoology. Welcome, come in. We're so happy to have you here. Here's your office. This is known as the cloaca. It's a very aptly named, of course. And one of the little bits of information that came out during the discussions is, did you know, by the way, that this used to be a morgue, and that there were these hooks up on the ceiling, and that they used to hang cadavers up there for the medical school. And so, you can imagine being a graduate student and you're sort of, I was one of these ones that like to really burn the midnight oil, that I would sort of be in there working away, and then suddenly you hear some little pin drop or some little noise, and find myself sort of whistling in the dark when I am all by myself in the cloaca, wondering about, how many disembodied spirits might have been sitting around waiting for some hapless graduate student to prey upon. Like some of the other people in the conservation session, I feel like I'm probably not, in many ways, a typical MBZ product or MBZ student. Obviously, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. And in many ways, I really don't do any biological collecting. I do a little bit of collecting here at my PhD, but I really don't collect. Like Russ Greenberg, I think I'm probably guilty of taking at best mediocre field notes. And as I think Jim Patton would probably attest, and I think I can say this without really any exaggeration, I was probably the worst student curator in the history, in the long, august history of the NBZ. Now, is Patton here? I want you to, am I exaggerating with that statement? Actually, that's really cold, Jim. You're supposed to agree with me. Anyway, so as I said, I've nonetheless tried to aspire to follow the MBZ path my way. I think that in many ways, the rigor, the intellectual rigor, the kinds of colleagues, the kinds of other students that one got to share experience with here, and the appreciation for natural history and field research is something that's been very important. And I've really gone on, as you'll see, I don't just work on animals anymore. In fact, I work with plants a lot. In many ways, I sort of consider myself a bit of a gadfly. I guess I've got a couple of unifying themes. And really, this is going to probably seem a little schizophrenic, because what I was just going to sort of quickly do is give you a very abrupt and rapid overview of some of the kinds of things that we work on. And by the way, I very much emphasize we, because we have a group. I have many different collaborators, none of which I'm really going to try to mention, but there's a lot of different people doing this work. But there's a couple of unifying themes. One is that all the work that we do is focused on the tropics, and second is it's all focused on conservation. And we're very much interested really in the interface between quantitative science or field research involving organisms, and then the interface of that with real life conservation, whatever that means. Conservation policy, trying to have an impact in the real world. So those are the kinds of issues, I guess, that have been sort of driving us in our group and our interests. So one of the first things one of my original interests has really been trying to understand how is it that people are impacting tropical ecosystems and biotas, and I just want to give you a couple of examples of this. The study that I've been involved with a lot in the last dozen years or so is this giant fragmentation study. If you study fragmentation, you would have heard of this, the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project in the central Amazon, started by Tom Lovejoy. And I don't have time to say much about any one of these particular topics. And in fact, I gave a seminar on this yesterday, but I just want to give you some examples of the kind of work we're doing. But this is very much looking at how forest fragmentation affects different groups of organisms. In fact, we've actually been working on trees and lianas and other groups of plants there. And it's been, I'm probably generously described as a botanically challenged, so this has been an interesting exercise. But there's major changes in terms of the plant communities within these fragmented forests. There's an enormous increase in tree mortality, for example, when you get close to the edges of the fragments because of the microclimatic stresses and the increase in wind shear and wind disturbances that you get in the fragments. This ramifies all through the forest. It alters the floristic composition of the forest. Okay, okay. I think the battery might be running out, I'm guessing. So, okay, I'm going to do manual. Does this have a page down? Oh, it's not a little computer, it's an app. Page down. Okay. So there's higher tree mortality within these forest fragments. This affects all kinds of things like so it changes species composition. There's all kinds of complicated, nuanced changes in species composition. By the way, we're dealing with about 1,300 species of trees, which is about twice what they have in North America in our study plots down in the Central Amazon. And there's also major kinds of ecosystem changes. For example, there's a huge loss of the biomass of the living material of the forest, and about half of that is carbon. And we estimate, for example, so what this really means is that a lot of the live biomass within the forest is being killed as a consequence of these dramatic changes in forest dynamics, huge forest disturbances. And so a lot of the carbon storage in the forest is being lost. And not only is tropical deforestation, which people think accounts for maybe 20 or 25% of all human greenhouse gas emissions, important. But in fact, the fragmentation of the forest also causes emissions. And we estimate that if you extrapolate on current deforestation numbers, that just the fragmentation of the forest could be producing about 150 million tons of atmospheric carbon emissions a year, which is approximately equivalent to what all of Great Britain is producing, for example. So it's a non-trivial impact there. Also harkening back to my days as a graduate student, I've had a long-term interest in the wet tropics of Australia, where Craig Moritz has done a lot of work, and others. This is a very special part of the world because, for one thing, tropical rainforests used to have a huge distribution throughout much of the tertiary, but now they've just shrunk to tiny relics of their former distribution, only about 3/1000ths of the continent's land area in tropical Australia. But there's many, many endemic species found within these forests. So really, it's some of the most biologically rich real estate anywhere on the planet. And one of the most important centers in all of tropical Australia, and really by virtue of that, all of Australia, one of the most important centers of endemism is what's referred to as the African uplands right here. It's a huge center of mammalian endemism, has some of the most species of the most restricted geographic distributions of anywhere on the Australian continent. And unfortunately, as you can see here, it's really been hammered. Much of it's been destroyed for cattle farming, and also in the lowlands there's been a lot of forest destruction for sugarcane. And the bottom line is it's been, the landscape has been fragmented for a long time, and it's been pretty good historical data. So we've been studying different groups of organisms for my PhD. Spent a lot of time trapping, different kinds of trapping techniques, and also going out and spotlighting for mammals. And I really had a wonderful time. It had just been exactly 20 years since I had done my PhD study, and so we went back in 2006 and 2007, and I wasn't going to do mammal trapping. That was way too much work. There's no way to even contemplate that, but the spotlighting is fun and easy. So we spent several months spotlighting, going out at nighttime and spotlighting possums and tree kangaroos and wallabies and things. And it was great, and it was nice to do that. So we could do things like develop models of extinction kinetics. We could basically model how rapidly species are disappearing from these forest fragments as a consequence of the variation in the fragment area, for example. This is a lemur possum, by the way, which is one of the really extinction-prone species in the area. This is another example of sort of land use. This is one I just sort of threw in because it's so off the wall. We've recently, some colleagues and I recently stumbled onto the fact that in Central Africa, the logging operations there, and by the way, I should just mention the Central African tropics are experiencing what you might call a perfect storm of logging activity right now. There's an incredible explosion going on there. Huge investment by China. China's basically buying just about every round log coming out of Central Africa. Well, some purchased by some European countries, but China's $60 billion of the global timber market. And unfortunately, what's happening in addition to this big explosion in domestic production, is that, and surprisingly, there's vast amounts of timber coming down the rivers. The rivers are the main transportation routes for a lot of this timber. And so in Gabon right now, we're working about 4 million cubic meters of timber is coming down, either in rafts or on barges every year. And unfortunately, just a small fraction of those get loose. They break away from the rafts, or they fall off the barges. In some cases, it's thought that maybe unscrupulous timber operators may lose some of the defective logs. But the bottom line is they wash down the rivers, they wash out to sea, and they end up washing up on the beaches. And we've done an aerial survey, we've flown on all the beaches, and we've counted about 11,000 logs worth about $11 million along the beaches, and that's just not all the logs. Obviously some of the logs are going other places, but unfortunately, two of the main places where the logs are ending up is in Pangara and Mayumba, which are two of the most important sea turtle nesting beaches in the world, including for the leatherback turtle, which is a critically endangered species. It's the largest turtle species in the world. And so these logs have all kinds of nasty impacts on the turtles. On the main nesting beach at Pangara, more than 30% of the beach is completely blocked with tangles of logs. And so the turtles, typically one of three things happens. The turtles either bump into the log, and they're quite cumbersome on land. It's energetically very expensive time and very stressful time for them. And so they try to get around the log, and they simply can't, and so they give up and they abort the nesting attempt and they go back into the sea. A second thing that happens is sometimes they come in, they hit the log, and they have to get up to the very top of the beach in order to nest, because otherwise the tides will come in and inundate their eggs. And so, unfortunately, they will typically, or they will sometimes just dig their nest right there and nest. And it takes about 2 months for the eggs to incubate. And so, unfortunately, that's too low. So the tides will come in, and salt water will kill the eggs. And the other thing that happens is that the turtles sometimes try to crawl over the logs, and they get all tangled up, and they can't escape. And so this, for example, is a leatherback turtle that's gotten entangled in the logs, and it's died. You can see the ghost crab fucking its eyes out there. So it's that's a non-trivial source of mortality. So that's sort of three examples of the kinds of issues that we're interested in terms of impacts. Another thing that we've been really interested in is what you might broadly call environmental synergisms. You know, we're not just changing the world in one way, we're changing it in all kinds of different ways simultaneously. So the point is really, what does that mean? And so one of the synergisms we've been very interested in is the interaction between forest fragmentation and fire. When you fragment landscapes in the tropics, typically a large intact tract of tropical rainforest is not susceptible to fire. When you fragment the forest and juxtapose them with cattle pastures and slash and burn farming plots, which are burned all the time, these fires can penetrate into the forest fragments, and it's a very alarming situation. You can see here, for example, this is the estimated fire frequency for about 400 forest fragments in the eastern Amazon. You can see here how dramatically fire frequency increases as you're getting closer and closer to forest edges. And these fires, although they don't look very impressive, in fact, they burn through the understory, they kill virtually all the vines, all the forests, and maybe 20 to 50% of the trees. Well, those then rain down their litter on the forest floor. The canopy thins out, and so the conditions can get drier. And so really what you're ending up is something much more like tinderbox conditions. And then the subsequent fires that come through are much more intense. And so you get something really scorched landscapes like this. Looking something like this with very little conservation, right? You can effectively see these fragments imploding over time when you're studying them in time series images. So that's one of the synergisms I think is quite alarming in places like the Amazon. Another synergism is the interaction between logging and hunting. This is happening all over the tropics, but the area where we've been working on is Africa, where there's a very strong culture of hunting there. In fact, the Central African tropics are probably the most intensively hunted tropical area in the world. Total estimates now are up as much as 5 million tons of bush meat being harvested in the Central African forest every year, and probably 60% of the vertebrates there that are hunted are not being hunted sustainably. So the big problem now is that the loggers are bulldozing roads, ramifying deep into forest tracts, which historically would have been refugia for wildlife populations. And so we've been working in southern Gabon, and basically we've had some crews there off and on since 2002, and we've had some excellent, this is Barbara Kroos, who's a Dutch scientist, but we've had some excellent Gabonese field technicians that are former hunters, and they're just amazing in terms of their knowledge of animal science, scrapes, dung, footprints, calls, chirps, whatever you have. They're very, very good at identifying different kinds of animal science. And then we've also gone back now and repeated the studies. We have 72 study sites in southern Gabon, and we're spotlighting at night, and we're picking up many new species. For example, things like tree pangolins, a lot of the galagos, the bush babies, the nocturnal primates. There's quite a whole assembly of things that you just don't see. And this just shows you one example of the kind of data we're collecting here. For example, you can see here that this shows you for our sites as a function of distance away from roads here. So here's the road surface right there, and this is an estimate of elephant abundance. And you can see here that it looks like we're getting a negative response both inside a hunting reserve and outside in areas where there are hunting. Excuse me, inside a reserve where there's no hunting or very little hunting, and outside where there is hunting. But it appears to be a steeper negative response outside of the reserve, which is more or less consistent with what we would think. And we've been generating that for lots of different kinds of species. We're also been broadly interested in what you might call the global change phenomenon, and also regional change phenomenon, which there's a lot of things happening in the tropics. For example, using our long-term plots in the Amazon, I mean, we're actually quite mystified for some time because we found that our intact plots, our control plots, in the intact forest in our fragmentation project were not behaving like controls. And my wife, who coordinated the work on the herbarium there, was really quite defensive and annoyed with me when I dared to suggest that there could have been some kind of systematic bias in the plant identifications going on there. And she assured me with some severity of tone of voice that that was not likely to be happening. And so we eventually found a completely independent study, and from another investigator who had done a study there. We actually paid for him to go back and resample his plots, and lo and behold, when we compared our results with his results, the winners in our plots were the winners in his plots, and the losers in our plots were the losers in his plots. So there were something happening. Now, what exactly is going on? There's a lot of controversy, but one of the main hypotheses is that this is a consequence of increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. CO2 in lab experiments tends to act as a fertilizer for a lot of species. The signature changes that we're seeing are consistent with elevated productivity in the forest. We're seeing higher growth rates, higher tree mortality rates, which is consistent with higher growth because you get more competition and therefore you get more mortality. You tend to get higher recruitment because you get more mortality. The whole forest becomes more dynamic. And also you expect to see shifts in species composition because not all species respond the same way. And the kinds of changes we're getting are essentially consistent with what you'd expect from increasing productivity. For example, here, this is showing data from about 22 years. So this is for a bunch of tree genera here. This is showing the overall average rate of average change. So these are the winners up here and the losers down here. And as a function of their trunk size, you can see that most of the trees that are losing are smaller trees. Most of the trees that are winning are bigger trees. Bigger trees are up in the canopy. They've got lots of light. They've got lots of productivity. And the lab experiments suggest that it's the faster growing species that are better able to exploit higher levels of CO2, whereas these slow growing species adapted for the shady understories don't seem to be doing as well. So again, it's consistent with higher productivity. It's consistent with the CO2 fertilization hypothesis, which, by the way, implies that even the remotest areas of the Amazon are now being affected by anthropogenic change. But there's competing ideas. There's other ideas. It's controversial, very controversial. Another issue that we've been interested in is things like storm impacts on forests. As you know, cyclones and hurricanes and monsoons are basically giant heat dispersal engines. When we've got warmer sea surface temperatures, these things tend to increase. So there's, again, controversial area, but generally speaking, people think we'll probably see more intense storms in the future and cyclones in the future. And so we've been very interested in studying the impacts of, and I guess either by good luck or bad luck, in my study area in North Queensland, both in 1986 and in 2006. In fact, just months preceding in both cases when I really wanted to go back and do my field work, we've had massive cyclones that have come in and disturbed the forest. And as Craig mentioned, this book I did called Stinging Trees and Wait a While, we have these really obnoxious plants. These things, by the way, the sting can last for up to a year. And these things, Australians call them wait a whiles. They have these vicious fishhook-like spines that will grab you. And they also call them lawyer lines, which says something about lawyers. But anyway, these things just proliferate when the forests get disturbed. And you can see here, by the way, this shows comparing forest fragments to intact forests. And you can see in this organization analysis here, there's just a lot more forest damage and a lot more disturbance adapted plant species within these fragments on average. And just finally, an area where we've been very interested is policy and action, and been involved in various kinds of courses and various kinds of initiatives to try to forward some of these aims. I just stuck this photo in here, not to actually show people that I actually own a suit, but this was Smithsonian and several other groups actually got a $100 million grant from HSBC Bank to study global climate change. And that's not what's impressive, but what is impressive about it, that's David Attenborough in the background there. And so I got to go and be part of this, small part of this thing when we accepted the money, and there were the bankers in the room, and then it was me. It became quickly apparent that David Attenborough was not interested in talking to bankers, so I got to had it for about half an hour. Anyway, so one of the issues in terms of policy initiatives that we've been very interested in is just Amazon forest destruction. This is a whole other talk, and I just wanted to mention that this has been a major area of our focus in terms of the huge avalanche of infrastructure development and other kinds of changing threats to the Amazon, the increasing impact of globalization and industrial drivers, things like large-scale cattle ranching. There's now 74 million head of cattle in the Brazilian Amazon, government-sponsored colonization projects, industrial soy farming. There's 7,500 kilometers of new paved highways being put in, about $40 billion in investment in major infrastructure projects going in the Amazon right now. So it's profoundly changing the Amazon, and there's a lot of discussion, needs to be a lot of discussion about the future of the Amazon and what the Amazon is going to look like as a consequence of really these seismic changes in the transportation and other kinds of development strategies that are happening in the region. This is some of the work we've done, which is trying to look sort of systematically at the impacts, projected impacts of some of these different kinds of development. Just generally speaking, we've been very interested in terms of drivers of deforestation, and one of the issues is just the huge flux of illegal timber across the world. This is just a gigantic issue. One of the really thorny issues is trying to get a handle on dealing because timber operators are creating these networks of roads, and that's tending to open up a lot of forest frontier areas to sort of a Pandora's box of spontaneous colonization and land speculation and other kinds of destructive activities. So understanding the illegal logging is very important. As I mentioned, and not to pick on China, but the Chinese entry into the major timber market has really changed the dynamics of the tropical timber industry. 10 years ago, China was consuming about 12 million cubic meters of timber a year. They're now consuming about 45 million cubic meters a year. Half of all the timber shipped anywhere in the world now goes to China. And not to blame, it's not fair to pick on China because most of the timbers is actually exported to, guess what, North America and Europe. So we're all culpable here. We all need to be aware of these kinds of important changes. But right now, unfortunately, there's a big disconnect between the huge influx of often illegally harvested timber. Even China acknowledges this, but from Papua New Guinea, from Indonesia, from Myanmar, from many Central African countries going into China. And there's just not an acknowledgement of the right kinds of steps that need to be done in order to try to get a handle on that. Biofuels are going to be a really big issue in the tropics. We're talking about oil palm, sugar cane, soy. The tropics is where things grow the fastest. The tropics is where the land is cheapest. And I read a very interesting book not very long ago, published in 2004. It's called Into Oil. And the author kept talking about how unthinkable it was going to be when oil hit $40 a barrel. And, so we're at 110 right now, and it'll be 200 before you know it. And with rising energy prices like that, there's going to be, I don't care if people are ambivalent about biofuels, but there's going to be incredible pressures to expand biofuel production. And a lot of this is going to be concentrated in the tropics. And this is incredible implications of this. It's because of the globalization forces, because of indirect effects. I just wanted to mention here, for example, even U.S. policies are probably affecting things. For example, the U.S. is currently putting massive subsidies into corn for corn ethanol production. And so this has had a big impact on the U.S. Farming communities and economy. For example, as a consequence of these giant corn subsidies, domestic corn production in the U.S. has increased by a quarter, and soy production, the U.S. is the largest producer of soy. Soy production has fallen by about a fifth because soy farmers and corn farmers tend to use the same land. As a consequence of that, in concert with very high demand, soy prices have basically doubled in the last 14 months, and that is apparently promoting a big spike of deforestation in the Amazon and in the Cerrado environments where these decisions that farmers make are very sensitive to commodity prices, to global commodity prices. And so you can see here, we don't even have the deforestation data yet, but we do have satellite data on fires. And we can compare dry season fires in 2006 versus 2007. Here you can see states with little soy in the Brazilian Amazon with some soy and lots of soy. You can see it's obviously these huge spikes in fires in the areas where soy is being produced in the Amazon. So it seems to be that these signals of international commodity prices, which are influenced by, in this case, things like U.S. policies, can be potentially important. Public outreach is another area that we're very interested in. I've been fortunate to be involved in a project that the Smithsonian and Yale are running together. We've got a $5 million grant to train environmental decision makers in Latin America and in Asia. So this is sort of a nascent program that's sort of in the second year now, really starting to get moving. And we're hoping we have good things for that. And finally, I just want to mention, very broadly, we just feel it's absolutely crucial to get out there and engage the public. We really have to transcend the kinds of audiences that sometimes we focused on and talk very broadly to people. And so, whether we're talking about a Caboclo Indian here, this is a beer-bellied stubby shepherd from North Queensland, Australia, or even a very suspicious-looking timber cutter there from somewhere. I think we really have to reach beyond our traditional audiences and really try to talk to them about conservation in the natural world. Thank you.